Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of You're the Cure. I'm Dr. Ben Edwards. That's not just a gimmicky title to catch your attention. That You're the Cure title of this show, it actually started 12, 13 years ago when I made the transition out of conventional medicine into root cause resolution. And I had a local radio station call me and say, "Hey, will you come do just a call in radio show once a week? The public wants to call and ask you questions." And I thought, sure, I don't know much. I'm barely learning this new stuff about the truth. But yeah, let's do it. So then they asked me to name the show. And of course, I was just so blown away by the truth I was learning at the time, that the body can fix itself. It just needs stewarded, it needs certain inputs, and it doesn't need other inputs. It's really that simple. There is no way a doctor can cure you. Your body's got the design, it's got the fix. And this is including your body's design to defend itself against toxins, germs, cancer cells, rogue cells that are turning into cancer cells. You have the most amazing cancer detection system, virus, bacteria detection system, you can detox, you can kill germs, and you can kill cancer, but you need to steward this immune system. One of the most eye-opening parts of my journey, and it was about a year into learning the truth and starting my own practice outside conventional medicine, I had three separate occasions, three different moms that brought their children to me to see me as a clinician, and they had the same story. And I had not looked into the whole vaccine autism connection or vaccine in any connection, SIDS, chronic disease, any of that. Didn't want to. Of course, I'd been trained like every pediatrician and family practitioner and every physician. Here's the schedule, the CDC schedule for kids. Memorize it. We'll test you on that, and then you go implement it in your clinic. So when those three moms came with the same story, it caused me to go digging and go looking. And if you've listened to the show for a while, you've heard me interview Dr. Andy Wakefield. You've heard me interview Dr. Brian Hooker, Suzanne Humphreys, Paul Thomas. And we have all those archived on the website under the vaccine topic. You can look at that, guys, if you're new to the show. But our guest today, Del Bigtree, has just produced another film, an amazing film, An Inconvenient Study. And we're going to talk to Del about that. And to me, this is one of the most groundbreaking. Probably it's where I'm going to start introducing this whole. When I have physicians call me who are kind of waking up and trying to come out of the system, pediatricians in particular, there's certain resources I'll point them to pretty quickly to just help them to open their eyes even more. And this is one of those pieces of amazing, creative and factual and documentary all put together in one. So Del Bigtree, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us today.
I appreciate you having me. I'm looking forward to this conversation.
All right. Well, I definitely want to get into this. And guys, the website, aninconvenientstudy.com, you can go check that out. And we'll talk about that more. But before we jump into this incredible study and documentary that was just produced recently, Del, for people that are new, don't know the background, how did you start to open your eyes to this topic of vaccines and potential risk and damage from those?
Well, the risk part of it happened while I was working at the CVS talks with the doctors. But full disclosure, I grew up in a family that did not go to doctors. So I was not vaccinated myself as a child. My mother and father were, I guess you could just say, hippies from the 1960s that marched in Chicago and were really into natural health. We were macrobiotic when I was a kid. And just sort of, I was raised believing exactly what you started out with, which is your body's designed to heal. And that all you need to do is give it the right nutrition and things, and everything else will happen naturally. My dad was a minister, so I was raised to believe that, what the Bible says, that you are created in the image and likeness of God. There's nowhere in there that said that I am born disease-filled and I need to be pumped full of vaccines to live on this planet. But when you grow up, I'm probably the most like kids that grew up under chiropractors, which is the only group I know of that really didn't vaccinate their kids across the board. And you don't really think twice about it. It wasn't a part of my daily thinking process. It was just, we just didn't go to the same kinds of doctors as everybody else. But it was ironic when I ended up my career in media really took off when I first got a job with the Dr. Phil show, and then he created a medical talk show called The Doctors, which was the first of its kind panel of doctors, and I was one of the producers on that show. My mom would call me and say, "What are you doing working with on a medical talk show? You've never been to a doctor in your life." Um, and I remember just feeling like I just felt like there was something divine about that appointment there. I was really challenging the medical establishment. I would do stories about how a drug had just been recalled, and not just that it was recalled, how many people did it injure, why did it take so long to be recalled, what were the lies we discovered in the lawsuit that they knew about the whole time. I would also do stories like if Cleveland Clinic brought in chiropractic, which it did. I thought that was a big story. Or a doctor is using, acupuncture instead of anesthesia. Just things like that. It was always pushing the envelope of what mainstream medicine, because it was a mainstream medicine show. And so that's it. I did a lot of controversial stories in the space. I was very highly rated on the show, meaning my shows rated very well, which made my job easy. But what really was the sea change in my life was I was working on a very difficult, complicated show with a doctor, and he said to me in the middle of it, "You probably don't want me on your show." I said, "Why?" He said, "Well, I'm one of these doctors that believes that vaccines cause autism. If you look me up online, I'm undermined by people that are calling me a quack." And I said, "Well, this story doesn't have anything to do with that, so I'll worry about that." So we did the show, but he had asked me, while we were doing it, would you ever cover that story of vaccines and autism? I said, "Well, the doctors is pretty well locked in on vaccines are safe and effective." We had a show with Jenny McCarthy on here where the lead of our show, Dr. Travis Stork, didn't really act very well. So it's kind of a third rail, if you will, for the show. But I said to him, "Look, I'm fascinated by the topic. And if there's a huge sea change in this conversation, call me and I'll see what I can do." And so, sure enough, a year later, he called and said there's a whistleblower inside the CDC that's come forward, and he's saying that they're committing scientific fraud in the vaccine safety studies. His name was Dr. William Thompson. That was 2015. And I, saw what a great story that could be. And through an amazing, miraculous, really set of circumstances, my life took a career path into where I met Dr. Andrew Wakefield, who's the most controversial doctor maybe in the world. I know you've had him on your podcast before. And of course, he had already been working on this whistleblower story in the documentary. And so I teamed up with him, and it was the executive producer, worked very closely with him for a year to edit that and really make it the film that it ended up becoming. And I think a lot of people credit Vaxxed, that movie about the CDC whistleblower, with igniting the medical freedom movement around the world. It made it so that I could never work in television again, because that's what happens when you mess with pharma. But I knew that stepping into it, that was the choice that I was making. I felt like that story was just too important. There was just far too much, evidence and data, 10,000 documents that Dr. William Thompson provided showing the fraud and cover it up that happened to the CDC. And I just felt spiritually that, it was my destiny, that was what, I was designed to do, really. And that question by my mom, "Why are you working on a medical talk show?" was sort of answered. The truth is, I got about 10,000, like the famous 10,000 hours of editing science and medicine into entertainment over the 10 years I worked on that show and the Dr. Phil show. So what the film needed was exactly that. How do you take very complex science and studies and turn that into something people can understand, or even on some level be entertained by? I think it's hard to call Vax an entertaining film. It's an engaging film, but it's a powerful and it's sometimes painful film, because it's really incredibly sad, some of the stories that are there. That, though, I traveled the country with that film for a year. And what I realized, we started interviewing all the parents after the screenings. We were doing Q&As after every screening. I would always say at the beginning of the Q&A, "Would everyone with a vaccine-injured child please stand up?" I remember the first time I asked that was on the very first day we screened, after we'd been kicked out of Tribeca Film Festival. I mean, we were the most controversial film in the world, getting the worst negative headlines you could ever imagine. But technically that's the best advertising you could ever imagine. We had lines down the block. I don't think we ever had anything but sold out audiences everywhere we went for an entire year. But I would ask, would you please stand up if you have a vaccinated child? And three-quarters of the room stood up the first time I did that. I felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. I really did not have an impression that this issue of vaccines and autism was that big. I thought it was a real rarity. I ended up asking that question 4 shows a day, 5 days a week at least for an entire year. And every single time, between two-thirds and three-quarters of the audience would stand up. It was incredible to me that there was this much, an ocean of injured children, and somehow we were being told they didn't exist. And it really became a life mission then. And people would come up after the screening and say to me, Del, is it only the MMR vaccine and autism? And I would have to say, no, I'm interviewing after the screenings. People are lining up to tell their stories. We were shooting them. We were going live on Facebook Live and Periscope. We became a traveling reality show on this conversation. But every parent had a different story. It would, be a flu shot killed my baby, or a hepatitis B vaccine, Gardasil paralyzed my, star athlete, teenager, or we never got to the MMR vaccine that's in your film. Our child regressed into autism right after a DTaP vaccine. And so they'd ask me, what about the other vaccines? And I would say, I only have anecdotal stories, a lot of them, that are showing this, regression to all sorts of problems, including death. But that's just anecdotal. I wanted a better answer than that. So I started a nonprofit in the end of 2016 after touring with the film called the Informed Consent Action Network. And I hired international scientists all around the world to investigate every trial that had ever been done on the vaccines that we're giving our kids. And I was really most focused on, there's two words we hear: safe and effective. Safe and effective, this mantra that's been ringing out on vaccines for decades. I didn't care about the effective part. What I was seeing was this ocean of injury that I just described. I wanted to know how they determined that they were safe. And so we looked at, what did they do to establish safety the entire time? In order to get to the bottom of that story, because like I said, on the doctors, I would cover lawsuits where drugs are being recalled, but the vaccines have a particular problem I'm sure you've covered, which is this liability protection that was granted them in 1986. Essentially, the pharmaceutical industry blackmailed Ronald Reagan, said, we're not going to make any more vaccines unless you protect us from liability. They actually stated, we are losing so much money from death and injury cases in court that we cannot make a profit. So we're going to stop making these unless you protect us. Not, oh, we're going to figure out what's causing all the death and injury and make a better product like anybody else would. They didn't want to change anything. They just wanted to be exonerated from the guilt. And our government did that in 1986. So in order to get the type of information you might find in a court case that you're never going to have, I enlisted the help of a constitutional attorney named Aaron Siri, who I think will go down in history as one of the most important lawyers ever in America. And we took a different approach. We started suing the government. If the government's going to take on the liability protection, then forget about Pfizer and Sanofi and Merck. We're going to go after the government. And we started winning lawsuits against FDA, CDC, NIH, Health and Human Services, ultimately proving that all of this mountain of evidence, the mountain of evidence that have shown that vaccines don't cause autism, didn't exist. They didn't have it. We FOIA'd for it. We've sued for it. They couldn't provide it. And we made them sign affidavits from these court cases admitting that they didn't have the things that they said they had. So that's sort of, it's a long story, background, but I think it's my fastest way I can say what puts me here now is that long investigation. And in 2017, because we started winning lawsuits, nobody on CNN or MSNBC was ever going to cover it. They're funded by pharma, and we can get into how the television's controlled if you want. But I started my own weekly talk show called The High Wire at thehighwire.com. And we've been, talking about medical freedom, all the breaking science around the world like I used to do on the doctors, but with no bias towards the pharmaceutical industry. We tell the truth exactly as we find it.
Yeah, it's a great show, guys. If you haven't seen that, The High Wire, it's awesome. Dale, before we go into what led you up to your latest film, An
Yeah.
Inconvenient Study, maybe speak to the answer I'll get from pediatricians or other physicians, colleagues, is how could this be? Meaning, how could you not trust the CDC, not trust the FDA, these organizations? They're trustworthy. And honestly, that's what I used to think too. Like I said, we weren't taught in medical school to read a package insert or to really how to diagnose a vaccine injury or how to look for it. I didn't even know how to do anything on VAERS or that VAERS even existed. I think people know
Yeah.
about VAERS now because of the explosion after COVID.
Yeah.
But these physicians that are just completely blind and just don't know, ignorant from the standpoint of literally don't have the information, and they trust these organizations and institutions, the American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Family Practitioners, CDC. Why wouldn't I trust them? That's kind of the general answer. What would you say to those physicians who just can't bring themselves to understand or believe that?
Then I would then sort of give a history of times where those groups have gotten it wrong. What a doctor like that is asking is they want us to believe that they're perfect, that they never make mistakes, there's never errors. Um, and then there's the part of this question whether I should trust my doctor or not. But let me address the exact question you're asking. Let's talk about why doctors are asking this question. You see what it is, and I'd be the first to say it is really implausible that there's a product that was made that we were told makes children safer that is actually doing more harm than good, that has been promoted, not just promoted by our government, but forced upon our children by state mandates and CDC recommendations. Certainly, if these products had a problem, someone would have recognized that and let us know. We wouldn't see them increase from one vaccine in the 1950s to two in the 1960s, then 10 by the 1980s, then 54 by 2011. Certainly, someone was monitoring all that, right? I mean, and that's what you would assume. And to say, well, Dell's just a journalist. I mean, what does he know? I get it. I get how implausible this whole thing is. It is very shocking. But I would say this: here's how it happens. It's the same way every doctor that prescribed OxyContin did it. Do we fault those doctors with one of the greatest epidemics of our time? We have between 60,000 and 100,000 people dying from drug overdose because of the addiction caused by doctors that prescribed OxyContin. Now, every doctor that ever went near that drug knows for a fact that when they even started seeing what appeared like addiction in their patients, that was troubling because this product was said to be non-addictive. That was the whole genius behind OxyContin. Now, people have to remember we know a lot more now. We've arrested the Sackler family. We've taken the Sackler family to jail. We've taken, or to court, and Johnson to court. We know differently. But take yourself back to the early 2000s, 2010, 2012. A doctor was prescribing it, and if it looked like it was causing, addiction, they would say that's not possible, and they would still go to the CDC website, and they would go to the FDA website that were saying not habit forming. This drug is perfectly safe. In fact, in the middle of the OxyContin epidemic in 2012, I believe it was, the FDA, we already had 60,000 people dying a year from overdose because of this product. The FDA reached out to the Sacklers and Johnson and said, hey, any chance you think this drug might also be safe for children? And they allowed the very criminals that made this product to do their own safety test on children. And lo and behold, surprisingly, they came back and guess what? It is safe for children. And the FDA approved it for children when we were already having the devastating effects. So I would say to that doctor, how's that possible? If the
Hmm.
CDC and the FDA are, if you're going to live a life as a doctor that's just going to do whatever the FDA and CDC says, we're going to have some problems. Let's go ahead and bring up, while we're at it, Vioxx that caused heart attacks in somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people. And when they finally sued and won in court, it turns out that The makers of Vioxx always knew that it caused heart attacks. But the FDA never told us that. The FDA got it wrong again. The CDC got it wrong. The FDA and the CDC got it wrong on fen-phen. They got it wrong on Johnson and Johnson's baby powder, which we now for 50 years was causing cervical cancer, and no one got it right. So that's what I would say to doctors. Can we take the FDA and the CDC off of this pedestal of perfection? They're not gods. In fact, they're not really respectable clergy in any way, yet you are treating them that way. And then lastly, for any doctor that has blood coursing through their brain still, the COVID vaccine was the last travesty that they should have accepted as decent physicians. They were told by the FDA and CDC that the vaccine was 95% effective at stopping transmission. They went and told their patients that it was 95% effective. They told their patients that it was perfectly safe, even though they themselves watched with their own eyes as the trials only lasted really a couple of weeks after the second dose in the phase 3 trials, when all of a sudden the trials were basically shut down. We never saw the results of the vaccine in the entire 45,000, half of which were in a placebo. When we talk about Pfizer and Moderna had 30,000. I might be mixing those up, but one at 30,000, and then at 45,000. What they did was, as soon as there was 180 people that were infected, the study ended up just being of 180 people. They say a 45,000 person study, not true. After 180 people, they determined it looked like it was working amongst the vaccinated, so let's vaccinate our entire placebo group, and they erased our ability to track the health outcomes of a product that was killing animals in the animal trials prior to being rushed onto the market. We needed long-term science, and they erased our ability to get it. And now every doctor alive should be asking the question, how was it the FDA and the CDC got it so wrong? And I will tell you this, I reported on the high wire one day before any citizen in this country was ever offered that vaccine. We read the emergency use authorization, and it said very clearly inside of the documentation that was going to rush this product on the market. The trials were not designed to determine this vaccine can stop transmission. That's what they admitted. So I said, I don't know what you're watching on your televisions. I don't know who is saying this thing is 95% effective, but it's a lie. This product is not going to stop transmission. Of course, my YouTube channel was shut down. My Facebook channel was shut down. So now we had government censorship of anyone that was telling people the truth. It didn't matter. My numbers skyrocketed from 250,000 views per episode to nearly 7 million views per episode once we were in the center of COVID. So to any doctor out there, the FDA and the CDC have been totally and completely corrupted by the pharmaceutical industry. They have become shills for the pharmaceutical industry. All those regulatory agencies are doing really is promoting pharmaceutical products. They are not doing safety tests. They have no skepticism when it comes to new products whatsoever. And so the doctor is bearing the brunt of misinformation, false information, dangerous information, and then having to take the hit as the confidence in doctors continues to plummet across this country and around the world, because their CDC and FDA that they thought they could just take word for word has left them out, hanging to dry on many multiple issues, not the least of which was COVID and the lockdowns, which weren't scientific. And now Tony Fauci admits the social distancing 6 feet, they just made it up. And everyone recognizes no study in the world ever showed that a cloth mask especially, but not even N95 unless really properly fitted, had any capability of stopping a particle as small as a coronavirus. I mean, everything. They literally got everything in the pandemic wrong. And so any doctor that's dismayed, don't be dismayed at the people that don't trust you. Be dismayed with the system that you believed in, and ask yourself, maybe it's time to retool and learn how to study on your own the information. You should have been reading the emergency use authorization, not taking the FDA's word for it that it was 95% effective, and then you would have had it as right as we did on the high wire.
Are you ready to take control of your health together? You're not alone. Dr. Ben, as well as a mission-driven team here at Veritas, created this online wellness membership because so many are suffering. We want to help more people by sharing the truth that we believe will change lives. Veritas Wellness membership is more than just a wellness program. It's a movement designed to empower you with truth, practical tools, and a support community at a price that's accessible for everyone. One membership covering your entire household. Upon signing up, you gain access to life-changing educational resources, expert-led webinars, live movement classes and exercise series, community groups and wellness initiatives, interactive classes, as well as exclusive discounts on supplements and advanced lab testing. We also offer complimentary peace consults, a space for you to go deeper, discover who you were created to be, and explore how stress contributes to disease. We believe in getting to the root cause and understanding why what we believe truly matters. Our team of wellness navigators are here to guide you every step of the way. So whether you're just starting your wellness journey or ready to go deeper, there's something here for you. So jump in today. We can't wait to walk this journey with you. Visit VeritasWellnessMember.com to get started.
Amen. I'm just going to cut that clip and send it to every doctor that calls me. And I do want to say to these colleagues of mine, and hopefully that are listening or will listen in the future, I honestly believe most doctors that were in my medical school class were there for the right reason. I'm sure there were some there for the money, but the vast majority I can attest to, they love people, they love science, they thought this scientific method could be used to help people. Bottom line, that's why we went to school. And so, I mean,
Good intentions.
there you go.
I
Yeah.
mean, I think, and I want to recognize that too, that I know doctors really believe they're doing what's right. They're not evil people. That is never a statement I would make. But at a certain point, when you
Mhm.
are causing so much destruction, when the work that you're doing, when you watch children decline from a 12.8% chronic disease rate in the 1980s, and now they're at 54% chronic disease, you're a part of that. If you're a pediatrician, what are you doing? You
Yeah.
must have some part of that. Our FDA, our regulatory agencies that you seem to be bowing down to, they are allowing some form of toxic chemicals into our environment. They are the ones approving them and said to be safe, whether it's in our food or in our water or in our beef or sprayed on our crops or injected into us. One or all, a combination of all these things are going to prove to be the problem. And at the center point is doctors that are doing nothing about it, regulatory agencies that are doing nothing about it. So everyone's looking the other way. So at a certain point, I start losing my empathy for doctors and their lack of understanding. At a certain point, you've got to recognize that you are being used as a useful idiot. And I mean, that's where I'm at now. I know I'm being harsh, but it's unacceptable to watch the decline of health in children and not feel like you have some part of that. What are you doing to investigate what is happening to our children? This is the sickest nation of children in the industrialized world. We have more babies die on the first day of life in America than every other industrialized nation combined. 75% of our children are said to not be able to be healthy enough to qualify to join our military. So, what are we celebrating? What value do you have if your job as a pediatrician is to make our children healthier? This last 40 years is the greatest decline in human health ever recorded. I'm going to put that in your lap and ask you what you're doing. What are you doing about it?
Yeah, that's a great point and great question, and leads us right into your latest film, An Inconvenient Study. Because
Mm-hmm.
ultimately, guys, big picture, stepping back, just like Dell said, the health of our children have totally declined. But is there a group of children where that hasn't happened? That question has been asked. It was asked some years ago. There were multiple studies starting to come out over the past few years looking at this, fully vaccinated or partially vaccinated even versus completely unvaccinated. Who's healthier? That's an obvious big picture core question. And then if you find a group that's actually healthy, let's study it out and see. And how much can we determine how much could be the hyper vaccination? I'll say so much, so early, so many. forcing the immune system to do some things that could potentially cause some chronic inflammatory immune dysregulation, i.e., autoimmune disease, inflammatory based disease, including cancers. So, Dell, let's talk about that.
Yeah.
Vaccinated versus unvaccinated kids. Previous studies, when did you start seeing those? What led you to make this, encourage someone to do a study that you could document?
Well, I'll tell you, the first vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies were ones that I witnessed as I was traveling the country with Vaxxed. Um, Almost every stop, I would run into at least one parent that would say, my child regressed into severe autism after their vaccines. It got worse and worse. And every time I would ask the doctor, are you sure it's not these vaccines? Because it seems like it gets worse. They scream, they get fevers, they're getting really sick. Every time I vaccinate them, the doctor says, nope, that's been studied. Vaccines don't cause autism. And so I would vaccinate them again. And it wasn't until, this is how they would tell the story, it wasn't until my second child, I was like halfway into the vaccine program, when it was so clear that they were injured by a vaccine. Immediately upon receiving it, started having seizures, went into fever, went into overload. And I, cut back on the vaccine. I said, that's it, I'm done. And so my first child is nonverbal, in a diaper, 18 years old, incapable of surviving on their own, severe autism. My second child that only got half the vaccine program, they have Asperger's. They're quirky. They have difficulty in social situations, but they're a straight A student at Harvard right now. They're doing very well in school. My third child never got a single vaccine because I knew better then. And my third child is valedictorian of the high school, is the star football player, star track athlete. They are so off the charts. They never get sick. So those were the first vaxxed, partially vaxxed, and unvaxxed studies that I saw. And if you heard it once, write it off. When you hear it 10 times, start listening. When you hear that 100 times, man, you really got to start asking yourself, what are we talking about? But you're right. Then you have smaller homeschool studies. Dr. Mawson out of the University of Mississippi did a homeschool study of 600 children and found that the vaccinated were far sicker. Higher rates of autism, higher rates of neurodevelopmental disorders, higher rates of autoimmune disease. And then you have Dr. Paul Thomas, who had, I think, 30,000 children in his practice. And he decided, hey, I've been pretty open-minded. Some of my kids aren't getting vaccines at all. Some are delaying their schedule because I wrote a book on it, the vaccine-friendly plan, and some got fully vaccinated. Let me just compare their health outcomes and then see what we discover. Lo and behold, the unvaccinated are the healthiest among them. They almost never get sick. Sure, they get chicken pox. They might even get measles, but they're not getting plaque psoriasis, eczema, asthma their entire lives. They don't descend into chronic disease for their entire lives. And there's several studies like that. Before I get into the study at the center of the Inconvenient Study, I want to approach this with reason. And this is what I do. I'm not a doctor. I look at this like a journalist. And so people will say to me, all right, I recognize that 54% of our kids have chronic disease. That sits into two categories: neurodevelopmental disorders and autoimmune disease. The more and more we look at neurodevelopmental disorders, the more we're recognizing it's coming from an immune dysregulation. Some immune dysregulation is causing inflammation. That inflammation is going to the brain. The brain is swelling in the children. They are getting brain damage from it, and that results in all sorts of different symptoms, as light as ADHD and as severe as autism and schizophrenia. So when we look at this immune dysregulation, as you call it, autoimmune disease is the crisis of our time. Now, whether you want to believe that or not, just watch your commercials. Every commercial break, you're getting 3 or 4 autoimmune disease drugs. It's also how the pharmaceutical industry is buying control of your television set. And so I would say this. People will say, Del, you're blaming it on vaccines. How do you know it's not the fluoride in our water? How do you know it's not the hormones injected into our beef? How do you know it's not the forever chemicals, the PFAS chemicals, or the plastics and the bisphenols or glyphosate sprayed on our crops? And I'll say, look, first of all, my nonprofit investigates all those things. And I think all those things should be off the market, or certainly there should be warning labels on all of it, in our food, water, you name it. But if we're going to talk about an autoimmune meaning immune dysregulation, meaning my immune system is suddenly, for the first time in human history, it's confused. It's now in a record number of people, their immune systems have stopped protecting them from outside elements, but are now becoming the attack force, attacking the cells in their own body. Every immune disease is exactly that. Diabetes, your immune system's attacking your pancreas. Multiple sclerosis, it's attacking your muscles and your myelin sheath. You go on and on. Crohn's disease, all of it. Gut biome, dysregulation. So if we're talking about dysregulated immune system, of all the things we just mentioned could be causing it, shouldn't we look closest at the one product amongst them that is designed to alter your immune system for life? Come on now. Now, if I stop someone on the street and say, what is a vaccine? They didn't go to med school, but they'll take a pretty good guess. They'll say, I don't know. It's like we take some weak form of a virus or a bacteria and we inject that. And because it's not as harmful, our body, mounts and, tricks our immune system into thinking it's had a disease. And then I have memory and immunity to it. Well, let's just take that definition. It's close enough. We're not just tricking your immune system one time, though, or 10 times, or 20 times, or tricking your immune system 40 times, or 50 times, or 60 times. Now, in the childhood schedule, we are tricking their immune system 72 times, 72 vaccines by the time you're 18. And lo and behold, we're just bewildered why the immune systems of these children have just gone totally haywire. And now, instead of fighting viruses and bacteria, it's fighting my heart. It's fighting my pancreas. It's fighting the muscles in my body. Could it possibly be that tricking our immune systems that many times is causing that? It's a hypothesis, and I think it's a pretty sound one. And when everyone in medicine says vaccines is the one thing they're going to refuse to investigate on this, what are we talking about? That should be at the top of the list. Disprove that that's what's doing it. And so how you disprove that? Why don't we compare children that receive vaccines to those who get none? And that's what we just talked about in the Mawson and Thomas studies. But those studies have been discounted by mainstream media that want to continue to defend vaccines as the greatest invention of the 20th century. And so in 2016, they'll go after those and say, well, Paul Thomas is an anti-vaxxer. Well, Mawson's study isn't big enough. They always have an excuse. So in 2016, when I was traveling with Vaxxed, I was pulling through Michigan, and somebody reached out to me and said, hey, I know the head of infectious disease at Henry Ford Health. Henry Ford Health is like one of the greatest medical institutions and research institutions in the world. I said, would you like to have dinner? Absolutely. So I sat down at dinner with Dr. Marcus Zervos in 2016. He made it clear from the very beginning of our conversation, I am pro-vaccine. I think vaccines are the greatest things of all time. I am the reason that Henry Ford Health has a mandatory vaccine program for everyone that works there. So I just want to be upfront that that's my position. I said, great. I kind of assumed that would be the case. He says, but I will tell you that, I watched your film Vaxxed. It's very compelling. But you've been saying something. I'll never forget this. You've been saying something as you're traveling the country. I see these YouTube videos of you speaking all over the place. You keep saying they have never done the proper science to prove that vaccines are safe. And he said, I obviously took issue with that. And so I sit on the biggest databases in the world, and I went to get all the research so that I could bring it to you tonight and show you that you're wrong. He said, but I am shocked that I have to sit across from you and tell you that you're right. I found nothing. There are no placebo-based trials of any of the vaccines we're giving our kids. I really have to tell you, I'm surprised by that. And then he said, but let me be clear, that doesn't mean they're not safe. It just means we can't scientifically say that they're safe. And I said, and yet you do say that they're safe over and over and over again on the television. There's no one could ever question it. We know they're safe. And now There's no way scientifically we know that they're safe. And he says, all right, I'll give you that. And he said, but I don't know what what I'm doing here, what we can do about it. I said, how about this? How about we wager a little bit? You sit on this giant database you were just bragging about. Why don't you do a study that compares vaccinated children to completely unvaccinated children? And he said, yeah, I could see the benefit of that. I would do that. I mean, I was shocked. I have to be honest. I was shocked that he agreed to it, and he did. So we left the dinner. I hounded him. It took a couple of years. By 2018, I said, are you going to do that study? Come on. You said you would do it. Let's do this. I flew out again in 2018 with my attorney, Aaron Siri, and we really said, Dr. Marcus Zervos, this is your opportunity to end this civil war that's going on in this country. And he said, you're right. And so he finally sat down and did it. And the study was finished in 2020. It was of 18,500 kids that were all born into the Henry Ford Health System. So they had every record of those children for the first several years of life. And they could compare those that were unvaccinated, which was about 2,000 of them, and 16,500 that were vaccinated. And unfortunately, as soon as the study was done, he refused to publish it. He refused to submit it to peer review. And I reached out and said, what's going on? You promised no matter what you found, we agreed you would publish it. You said you would follow the data wherever it leads. And he intimated to me at that time, Del, I did not agree to end the childhood vaccine program. I said, what do you mean? All that you've done is a study. He says, this study is going to be catastrophic to the vaccine program. And I said, really? What's in it? He's like, I can't really tell you. And so I kept calling from 2020 to 2022, will you please just do what's right? And finally, I had a speaking engagement up in Michigan, and I called him and I said, hey, I'm going to be in Michigan. I'm going to be up in Detroit. Why don't we grab dinner? He said, okay, let's get dinner. And I knew he sounded troubled. I knew there was something really bothering him, and I figured this was the last conversation we'd ever have. So I brought recording equipment, hidden cameras, and I recorded that dinner. And that is at the heart of this film. What did the study show? The conclusion of this study by a man who professed to be pro-vaccine, so I assume he had a bias in that direction and wanted to come out in favor of the vaccinated, but instead, and even says it, though we believe the vaccine program has benefits, this study shows that there may be real issues. And it showed 2.5 times the rate of chronic disease amongst the children that were vaccinated compared to those that were unvaccinated. 6 times the rate of neurodevelopmental disorders amongst the vaccinated compared to the unvaccinated, and nearly 6 times the rate of autoimmune disease like we were discussing. Remember, not 60% increase, not 100%. We're talking like 500% to 600% increased risks amongst the vaccinated. And there's one graph they did that I think is really the scariest part of the whole thing. They project over 10 years how many of the vaccinated children will have chronic disease versus how many of the unvaccinated. And it shows that 57% of the vaccinated would have chronic disease within 10 years, and only 17% of the unvaccinated. Those are gigantic, meteoric discoveries. Now, I'll say the study's never been published. Henry Ford Health sent a cease and desist to us, basically not wanting us to put out the film. Their claim is that the study wasn't published because the data was no good and the study didn't meet the rigors of scientific credibility. But that's why I had the hidden cameras when I met with Zervos, the head of their infectious disease. This is one of the biggest heroes they have at Henry Ford Health. And what does he say when I asked him? He said, it's a good study. It's a very important study. I'm just not going to publish it because my career would be ended. I'd be finished. And so it's pure fear. So the film's fascinating. It's a fascinating study of one human being. It's also a fascinating study of the pressures that now exist for any doctor or scientist that dares to try and venture and tell the truth. And to your point, this study does not stand alone. If it did, we should always, a retrospective study only has so much quality to it. If it's all alone, it shows us a signal. Let's do more. We should certainly do more. But this is about the fifth study. I hear Dr. Peter McCullough saying there's 10 or 11 vaccinated versus unvaccinated studies. So I'm curious what those are. Those are outside my reference point. But here's what I know: every single study that's ever compared these two groups of kids has come up with the exact same signal, which is the vaccinated are far sicker than the unvaccinated. So we have a real problem. Because as last I checked, the entire purpose of the vaccine program was to make our children healthier, not sicker.
Yeah. Well, to play devil's advocate, I think a pediatrician who might be listening would say, well, if you just ended that vaccine program, um, and all of a sudden there's zero vaccinated kids in this country, we're going to see this humongous rise in measles and, Haemophilus influenza and all the things. And there will be death from that. We'll have a tidal wave of death. And my answer, I'd love to hear yours. My answer to that would be, well, let's go back and look pre all these vaccines. Specifically, let's look at 1950-ish. And we've had Dr. Humphreys on the show and her book, Dissolving Illusions. Guys, if you are a pediatrician out there listening, get that book for sure, because that was eye-opening for me to see this infant mortality rate that was significant in 1900. In some places, 50% of the babies dying before they turn 5 years old, but a 98 to 99% drop in that infant mortality rate over the first half of the 1900s, prior to vaccines coming on the scene. Meaning measles may have been killing, 1,000 babies a year, and it dropped down to 100 babies a year or less. Those are rough estimates I'm talking about. And the reason that, and this is Harvard is saying this, and Hopkins and CDC researchers all looked at this, Boston University, McKinley, they've all published on this. It was sanitation, refrigeration, nutrition, hygiene, the terrain, clean up this terrain. What does that speak to? It speaks to your own immune system's able to work better when you're not living in slop and when you have nutrition. So it's not like we're just this tidal wave of infectious disease is going to kill our kids. And I would dare say, if you look at some of these studies that look at SIDS, sudden infant death, we haven't really talked about actual death from these medical procedures that are done on healthy kids. We're talking about chronic disease, which is bad enough, suffering, but actual death and how SIDS clusters around within 72 hours. I want to say it's around 70% of SIDS death cluster around these vaccines. So there's legitimate, real morbidity and mortality, both, that I don't think would even compare to measles, chickenpox, or any other infectious disease, especially if we started training doctors in how to treat these, even in a standard American kids who's not well nourished and whose mom wasn't well nourished and whose microbiome is shot. But there are ways to actually treat infections today, as even outside of antibiotics. So imagine if we could actually bring to bear the full force of all these integrative modalities, including ultraviolet blood irradiation. That's Mike Hamblin, over 800 studies published. He's out of MIT and Harvard. I think he's in South Africa now, but he's the man on photobiomodulation. And we're not even having that conversation at all. Or ozone, or all these other modalities, high dose vitamin C. That's another whole story, but I just want to say that would be my answer to those who would worry that, oh no, we're going to be overrun with infant mortality from infectious disease. What would you say, Dale?
This is going to be the most complicated part of our journey and our species right now. Because you're right. If you go back and look at the death rate, let's take measles, for instance. Let's use measles as the example because it's also the tracking. They track all vaccine uptake by how much is the uptake of measles. Measles vaccine is the center point of the vaccine program. So the death rate of measles in 1961, just prior to the vaccine coming online, is 1 out of 500,000 Americans would die every year from measles. Now, that's a population basis. That's the numbers. And so approximately, given the amount of people, about 400 people would die per year. You have to assume they probably had other comorbidities, were very sick, fragile. Maybe they had cancer. I don't know. But no one wants to see 400 deaths, but let's just hold on to that 400 deaths. That's 1 in 10,000 amongst those that are infected. And so I hear numbers like 1 in 1,000, not true. 1 in 10,000 amongst infected. And that's probably, on the heavy side. It's really hard to know how many people were getting measles because in 1960, nobody was worried about it. No doctor panicked about it. Every doctor knew to give vitamin A and many other things, and it would make it much more mild as experience. Every doctor knew how to treat it. But as you just pointed out, no doctor knows even how to diagnose it now in America. The pharmaceutical industry, this is where it's, I wish I had an easy answer, but it's not as easy as we want it to be. And those of us like me, I want my kids to have the measles. I want my kids to have the mumps. I want them to have the chicken pox. I'll tell you why in just a second. But we need, if we're going to recognize that this vaccine program is actually causing more harm than the original disease, we've got to figure out how to get back to the knowledge base we once had around these diseases, or we are going to have real issues. The 2 deaths in Texas are not from measles, they're from medical malpractice and a complete and total mishandling, not of measles, but a secondary infection and pneumonia that they flailed at, gave the wrong antibiotics, gave the wrong products, and essentially killed those 2 kids in Texas. They didn't need to die. They would not have died in 1960 had they had your usual local doctor. So we have a real problem of poorly trained doctors in this space. And so that's one thing. Also, and this is something you've got to think about. When you look at those that did die or the infections that did happen back in the 1960s or 50s with measles, no infant caught the measles. And we recognize, it didn't matter, we know measles is very infectious. And so an area will have immunity until enough kids are born and enough people are in there that have, either immigrated, that there's a large percentage that haven't. And then the measles would come in one season. Everyone would catch it. Everyone would develop immunity. And now you got a good 10 years on that island or that village or whatever where no one's going to see the measles. But when those moments happen, babies never caught it. And they know now, especially, that's because any mother that had caught measles as a baby, which was every mother, it was so infectious, everyone caught this thing, that they would pass on immunity to their baby for at least a year and a half. If you breastfed that baby, usually to 2 or 3 years old, that immunity from measles would continue. By the time you're 2 or 3 years old, you're at the perfect age to catch the measles. You have a robust immune system. You're going to do just fine. It's a very mild illness. Gets actually more dangerous if you've never caught it and you're an adult. Healthy babies do fine after they're 2 years old. But the vaccine program came along, and now we are fully we have enough generations that we only have vaccine immunity from measles. One problem: the vaccine doesn't confer any immunity onto the baby from the mother. Zero. And so for the first time in history, every infant born is now vulnerable to measles. And we don't want our babies catching measles. And so this is where the vaccine program has erased a powerful and beautiful infant, immunity that once existed that no longer exists, and we have no way around this. This is what Andy Wakefield would talk to me about. It's what Robert Kennedy Jr. is really thinking through right now. Is if we want to get back to real herd immunity, which has to happen through natural infection, then we've got to figure out how to do it slowly and carefully, because there are susceptible groups that were never susceptible prior to the vaccine program. I've made this statement: the vaccine program did not eradicate disease, which is what it set out to do. The only thing the vaccine program has eradicated is herd immunity itself. We no longer have herd immunity. And the baby boomers are dying off. They were the only ones that had it. So all of that to be a very complex answer. And so, no, it's not going to be easy. My kids will do fine. I know to give them vitamin A if they get measles. I know what to do, which is all of us. If anyone's going to decide to not vaccinate, recognize you can't not vaccinate and continue to drink Coca-Cola, eat Doritos, live a messy life and do no educating yourself and think, I'm going to be healthier. It just doesn't work that way. We need to be more conscious as we move forward This is all a part of something going on. And lastly, I would say this. You had 400 deaths from measles per year. There are some really gigantic, of millions of people, studies that show that a boy who has natural measles, never the vaccine, this doesn't work, but if you caught measles as a kid, it reduces your likelihood of having heart disease and heart attack by 10%. There's going to be nearly 1 million people will die of heart disease in America. Usually it's more prevalent in men, but let's just cut it in half. Let's say it's 500,000 men, just making it simple math. If 10% of them aren't going to die or have that disease, then you just save 50,000 people this year by allowing them to have the measles. So sure, we didn't want to see the 400 die of measles, but in protecting those 450,000 will die because they didn't catch measles. When you look at studies of measles and mumps in women, there's a 50% reduction in ovarian cancer if the woman had both measles naturally and mumps as a child. Again, tens of thousands saved by catching and allowing the disease to exist, whereas only a couple hundred protected by the vaccine program. I can do this all day long. Our immune systems were designed to be primed by catching these trivial childhood illnesses so that we would have more robust strength and bodies and immune systems in our future and live longer. And we are taking that away with the vaccine program. So this knowledge has to be disseminated. We need doctors to start understanding this. I doubt they will. So I am working to build new health systems with new training and people that say, I am not going to follow this closed-minded, head in the sand approach towards medicine that is making us sicker and sicker. Here's the simplest thing I think that, when I look at it, I guess it's a hypothesis. There's a lot of science behind this now. I believe we traded trivial childhood infections that lasted between 3 days and 9, maybe 2 weeks max, and measles or chickenpox. We traded a trivial childhood illness that was short-lived for long, full life, chronic disease. We are now diseased permanently. So if you're worried about the measles rash for, 7 days to 2 weeks, would you rather your child have bleeding ears and neck and the plaque psoriasis, the skin issue like leprosy all over their bodies their entire lives? That's what we've done to ourselves. We have taken a short, moment of illness and made it a lifetime of illness. And I would finish by Robert Kennedy Jr., my favorite line. I was his director of communications when he ran for president. He would say, a healthy person has 1,000 dreams. A sick person only has one. And so what American dream is there when 54% of our kids and now 76% of our adults have chronic disease? We're not living the American dream. We're not dreaming anymore. We're just trying to get through the day, and the pharmaceutical industry is injecting us and filling us and feeding us more and more products, and we're just getting sicker and sicker.
Yeah. Well, we're about out of time. A few minutes left, Dale. Maybe I'll let you just have these last few minutes to speak to, you've mentioned Robert F. Kennedy a couple of times, and you're his communications director for his campaign. He's in HHS. Obviously, it's been interesting and tough and some controversy there. Just this week, a couple days ago, CDC changed their website on do vaccines cause autism? And what they changed it from, I don't know exactly what it said before, but I'm pretty sure it said, no, they don't. They're safe and effective.
Yeah, so it used to say vaccines do not cause autism. Big heading across the top.
And now it says that statement, that exact quote, vaccines do not cause autism, cannot be said with any scientific evidence. I'm paraphrasing there, but basically it's saying there's no studies that allow physicians, doctors, or CDC officials to say that thing anymore. So we're not. That's big, real big.
It's really, really massive. In fact, Robert Kennedy Jr. has just, he gets a lot of pressure from people in our movement, in this medical freedom movement, as though he was supposed to go in and just turn a switch and everything would change overnight. He's being methodical. He's being intelligent because he's trying to teach this entire country, not just those that already have the information. Just like you and I, when we have these conversations, I could speak to the people that already know everything I just said. I'm trying to speak to those that maybe are just starting to dip their toe in here, because if they're not with us, everything Bobby does will just be set back and erased by the next administration. It is critical that we share our knowledge now. And that's why an inconvenient study is so important. It is a tool. I mean, we are getting rave reviews for exactly that. People saying it's really great for my friend, my brother that wasn't really wanting to look at this conversation. I sent them the movie and they just called me and said, I'm sharing this with everyone I know. This is so scientific. I had no idea. The film is really excellent that way at doing that. So it's for free. You can share it. You can download it. You can also download the study itself at aninconvenientstudy.com. Lastly, my nonprofit Informed Consent Action Network won a lawsuit against the CDC back in 2020, I believe it was, where we had sued them and said, give us every trial you relied upon to establish that the first 7 vaccines in the first 6 months of life do not cause autism, because your website says vaccines do not cause autism. That's all of them. Where's the evidence? I've seen some MMR studies, but where's the evidence of all the other 6 or 7 vaccines we give in the first year of life? And they came back and they had no science whatsoever. They had to concede. They sent us 20 studies of MMR. MMR is at 2 years old, and a bunch of thimerosal studies. There was no thimerosal in those childhood vaccines. And you'll see on the CDC website, it talks about, since you have had no science around the infant vaccines, you can no longer make this as a scientific statement. Certainly for those vaccines, there's real questions about the only vaccine that has actually ever been studied with autism, and that is the MMR vaccine. Most of the studies have been thrown out now by scientific bodies. There's a few remaining that hang in there, but there's real questions since none of them were ever tested against what? A completely unvaccinated control group. And so the science isn't there. We'll hear mountains and mountains of evidence doesn't exist. I've won in court. We've got great videos of Aaron Siri deposing some of the biggest scientists in the world. They've got no evidence. And so Bobby Kennedy is absolutely right. Of course, the pharmaceutical industry, the TV, all of our news is going crazy. It's a huge change. We also had a huge dynamic move just over a week ago. The first SIDS case, sudden infant death syndrome, won. They proved that this 11-month-old baby died because they received 10 vaccines at one time and died 4 or 5 hours later from brain swelling, which almost every vaccine lists as a side effect, encephalitis. All of this is coming to light. All of our pediatricians were never telling us that brain swelling is a potential side effect or that paralysis is a potential side effect from these vaccines. We're not making it up. It's written in the warning label. Ask for that warning label. At the very least, before you vaccinate, say, I want the warning label wrapped around the vaccine, or you can look it up yourself right now. Just type in FDA licensed vaccines. Also have the CDC childhood schedule open so you know the names of the vaccines that you want to use. Look up that name, click on it, then click on package insert, and you can read all of the ingredients, which will include things like aborted fetal DNA, hamster kidneys, and monkey parts. Mercury is finally out because of Bobby Kennedy, but aluminum is in there. All sorts of stuff you would never want in your child, but you can do that research. You have to do that research because your pediatrician is not doing that research yet, and that's very unfortunate. I hope that changes as we move forward.
And I do want to say on that baby that the family got awarded that award from the Vaccine Injury Court. It took like 11 or 12 years,
Correct.
multiple appeals. I mean, it was a process, but yes, a SIDS case finally, first time ever, gets awarded. So God bless that family. All right, Dale, I know we're out of town. Thank you for all your work. One more time, an inconvenientstudy.com, and then the Informed Consent Action Network. Where's
Yeah,
that
so
website?
that's icandecide.org, and then my show is thehighwire.com. But
Yep.
really, if I can burn one thing into your head, and inconvenientstudy.com, we just passed 50 million views worldwide. The
Awesome.
scientific community is debating the Henry Ford study, which you can read. It's very important, and we're asking really one thing from this film, and we want to teach everyone to ask this question. We want every government in the world to compare their vaccinated to their unvaccinated now. and show us if anyone is coming up with a different result. If you can't come up with a result that shows the vaccinated are healthier, there should be an immediate moratorium on vaccinating across the world. 54% chronic disease, a coin toss now. 1 in 2 children or worse is going to have chronic illness their entire life. That is not a life. That is not the American dream. We can do something about it. I really appreciate you taking the time today.
You bet, Dale. Thank you so much for being with us and for all you're doing. Guys, we'll be back next week with another great show. I'm Dr. Ben Edwards. Remember, you're the cure. We'll see you next time.